evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Having seen this film at my class this afternoon, I can just tell you, you made a really, really good choice. I knew that actually before I saw the film, but now I really can speak with authority on that. I'm Patty Limerick, and I'm going to not give you much of an introduction to these speakers because you are going to be so introduced to them by seeing the film and by hearing, or not seeing the whole film, seeing snippets of the film. Because this is such a prestigious and sought-after film that they can only show the full thing at previews, official previews, and to very elite groups like the group of my students this afternoon. So, but you will get a good sense of the film, and then that will put you in a frenzy, really, to see the full film, which will happen at some point. But if at much of the film, watching the film, you would see these two people who you get to see in three-dimensional reality. So it works out well. This evening, my first husband, Jeff Limerick, was an architect, and he died in 2005. We created a lecture series which had a very excellent plan for it. We were going to have architects, successful architects with merry and robust senses of humor, who built that sense of humor into their work. So we came out of the gate with Ron Radziner from Los Angeles, who was hilarious, and his work was so witty and so funny. And then we had Bart Prince from Albuquerque and Santa Fe, and his work was so witty and so funny, and he was so pleasant and amusing. And then we ran out of major architects with merry senses of humor. Oh no, that seemed like a good plan. If anybody knows somebody that we weren't able to find, there's a man from India at Howard University that people have been telling me about. So we may be back on that, well, and maybe not, we don't know. But we then had to say to ourselves, well, that didn't quite pan out. We must try to find something else that would suit this Jeff Limerick Memorial Lecture Series. And here Providence was very kind to me because there is a great program on campus, Invest. Yeah. How many have heard of or participated in Invest? Well, that's just a tiny number. So the rest of you must be feeling very bad. You must be thinking, where did I go wrong in life that I would know about this? So I will rectify that, though. Christopher, you might want to rectify it further. This is a thing created by Jim Downton, retired sociology professor. Anybody remember him? He wrote a wonderful book called Creativity in the Classroom, Awakening Minds, which is really a book every teacher should read. And he founded Invest, and it is for social engagement, for taking talented CU students and bringing them into, they take an extraordinary field trip, which we could hear more about. So I went to speak to that group as they were going to prepare, because they were preparing for their 4 or 5 week field trip through Colorado. And while I was there, I met 2 folks, Christopher and Merete, and they actually seemed to be unnaturally happy to meet me because it turns out they were working on a film and they wanted to interview me for the film. So the "how nice to meet you" had a little bit more of an edge than sometimes does. So you'll see me a couple of blessedly brief times here as a talking head, and more interesting people will be talking. So I learned about their film. When I discovered that they would be finished with this film, that's when it started to seem to me, okay, there are other ways of honoring Jeff Limerick's legacy besides the architect with a merry sense of humor, which I still have a little bit of hope for. But Jeff Limerick, I think, would have loved this occasion because he did admire and like enterprising and spirited and creative young people. And he also just, I think, would be knocked over by the intensity of what we learn about what it is to make a structure, what it is to say, what is a home, and to create that structure. So, to be frank, if he liked it or not, it would be nice if he liked it, but I can tell you I really like it. And I'm a figure in the Jeff Limerick Endowment, so we'll just go ahead with that. But I think those who knew Jeff Limerick, who were in the room, would testify when they see this that he would really have enjoyed this evening. So we really are so enchanted with these people because of our local ties in part. It's just a wonderful thing of home cultivated talent. Christopher is a CU graduate, and he is also a graduate of the CU Denver program with a Master's of Business Administration? Public, that didn't sound right, Public Administration. He was here very close to doing our certificate in Western American Studies, and do we have an honorary certificate in Western American Studies? Because if we do, we need 2 of them, because Merete started here at CU, and then, in what must have been an interesting administrative moment for both institutions, transferred to Naropa. So she has her degree from Naropa, and we see this evening as an occasion of real partnership in the every sense of that word between Naropa and CU Boulder. Are there Naropa folks here? And welcome, thanks for being here. Nice to have you here, and let this be the first of many such occasions for us. So I would give more of an introduction, but that would be wacky because here are these totally three-dimensional, actually more dimensions than that. How many are you counting? What? 17, okay, so a lot of dimensions, and they will talk to you about the film. We have several people in the audience who are also very involved in the tiny house. We got Cameron, we got Gift, so I think this will just be a great occasion for all kinds of ideas. And what I would like to just say from having, I think the people who were in class, I think person there, it was just such a great occasion to be in their company and to think we have choice. Things, we are not riding a escalator through time, of moving people's sidewalk through time. We have choice about how we live and how we are with each other and in what spaces we are with each other. And that seems like a Jeff Limerick message to me. So, Merete and Christopher.
Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you so much to Patty and the Center of the American West for having us. I don't know if we'll have huge senses of humor, but the subject is sort of absurdly silly, so I think we'll all laugh a little bit tonight.
Yeah, we actually, I'm just going to, we actually met somebody who saw our film, and it was we were doing an interview on NPR, and he was like, "You guys are just so sincere, it's almost a mockumentary."
And we were like, thanks.
But he meant it in a really good way, so we went with it.
Yeah, so we're sorry that we're not able to show the actual film tonight, but we're going to do a multimedia presentation that's going to include some clips from the film, as well as photos and things like that.
Okay, so I thought we'd start out by just sort of explaining some background to how we got involved in this. And I was in, as Patty mentioned, I was doing an MPA at University of Colorado, Denver, and I was sitting in class for like 8 hours a day, and I was about to turn 30, and I said to myself, what are you like doing? I mean, not that there's wrong with that, but I wanted to be outside more, and I really missed spending time out in nature when I used to do a lot of rock climbing and things like that. And so I always had this dream to build a small cabin on some land up in the mountains. And so that day I decided to just think like, well, what if I didn't wait until later to sort of, follow my dreams, and I just sort of went out and kind of worked towards that instead of working towards a degree and all these things that I thought I should be working towards. And so within a week or two, I actually just drove up to the mountains and kind of looked around at different pieces of land and ended up putting a little bit of money down on some land up here in the mountains. So as I mentioned, my first sort of inclination was to build a small cabin on some land, kind of like this. This was my dream. And this was also somebody else's dream, but it was a while ago. And so, this is what I had in my mind, a small cabin surrounded by all this beautiful land. And I called the building department of Park County, which is where this is, and my dreams were quickly dashed because it turns out that you can't actually build a small cabin on land anymore. You have to build at least 600 square feet in that county, and oftentimes more in other counties around the country. So once it became clear that that wasn't going to happen, we decided to build, I remember this article from Yes Magazine that I read back in 2009, which was about 2 years before this all happened. And it featured this woman, Dee Williams, who later would go on to be featured in our film. But she was living in this small 89 square foot house built on wheels. And I remember that, and I was thinking, oh, maybe that's why they're built on wheels, because then it's not actually a structure. And sure enough, I did some more research, and it turns out that tiny houses that is why they're built on wheels, is because they're a temporary structure. And so typical housing codes don't apply to them.
So Christopher's kind of an impulsive person, and he's known for kind of, leaping into these crazy situations and then, maybe later questioning them and things like that. But for once, I sort of matched Christopher's crazy idea with an even crazier one. At the time, he was finishing up a master's degree and was looking for a film project to take on after graduation. He has a background in film. And as a writer, I was kind of watching him go through the process of planning the tiny house. And I said, well, this is kind of an interesting story. Why don't you film the process of building it. And so that is how we decided to embark on the documentary that would become Tiny, a story about living small. We're going to show you the trailer for that right now.
Few months, I'll be 30 years old. And for the first time, I'm thinking about putting down roots. So I ask myself, what makes a good home? Since 1970, the average house size in the United States has doubled. But for some people, bigger isn't necessarily better. I heard about these people who live in tiny houses, and I wanted to know more.
You know, I guess the primary asset that comes with a small house is freedom. It's really just, the world gets a lot bigger when you're living small, because I can afford to do a lot more things now in terms of both cash and time. The whole world is now my living room.
Visiting other small homes inspired me to simplify my own life. I set out to build a tiny house and establish a place in the mountains.
The question I've always had is whether Christopher will actually finish the tiny house.
I've never built anything before.
It is quite a challenging project, and he's learning this as he goes.
This project is harder than I expected, but I think it will be worth it.
The interesting thing about the tiny house movement is whether we can turn it into an innovation. We don't all have to give up all our material possessions and live in 89 square feet, but let's think about maybe giving up our McMansions and building a little smarter.
Okay, so that'll give you a little bit of an idea of the project that we embarked on. So you might be asking, what is a tiny house?
So we struggled with this a little bit when we set out to make this film, because the closer we started looking at what a tiny house is, the more it sort of unraveled at the seams. You know, there are people in Manhattan who live in apartments the size of a tiny house. And there are plenty of people who, around the country, who, you know, live in really small spaces. But we kind of settle on this for the purposes of our film, just to sort of narrow what we're talking about. And that's a traditionally constructed house under 200 square feet in size. And it's often built on a flatbed trailer as a way of bypassing local building codes. It's also a really, really small house. And also, your house is the same size as my closet.
This is a quote from Ann Hawley, who is one of our characters that we interviewed. She lives in Longmont, Colorado. And she says that was the most common response that she got to people when she told them that she lived in a tiny house. And then this is sort of a photo of a common tiny house. This one belongs to Jay Schaefer, who is sort of the most recognizable name in the tiny house movement. He started a company called Tumbleweed Tiny House Company, designing houses about 129 square feet. Yeah.
So we're just going to take a break where I look something up real quick.
Yeah. We're going to show you another quick video, another quick tiny house tour that we filmed, actually with a man named Daniel who lives out near Telluride. So we found people living in tiny houses all around the country. We actually found quite a few living here in Colorado. And Daniel is one of them.
Placerville, Colorado, just outside of Telluride. And this is my house, the Ico, short for icosahedral, 20-sided geodesic dome. I had a head full of ideas, and I really needed to put them into practice. And although I work in construction and do have a little bit of influence over what happens on some projects, nothing gave me the freedom that building my own tiny house gave me and continues to give me. This is a laboratory for what's essential, what's not essential, what's beautiful, what inspires me and my friends, and what is sustainable. So my house is built at least 50% out of recycled and reclaimed materials. You can see from the siding, it's old wood flooring that came out of houses that are at least 50 years old. Likely they don't build like that anymore. The windows are all reclaimed. I only had to spend a couple $100 on them all, and I made them fit. Some of the basic utilities of the building are quite basic. I don't have running water, but I like to say I have walking water, as we do have a well on the property. So I heat my house with wood. It's a resource that we have locally available, and I can harvest it myself. So my wood stove was actually a gift from a friend. It's made by the Birmingham Stove and Range Company. I doubt they're in business anymore, but they made this fantastic little stove called Magician, and it's basically just a cast iron box. It's actually quite large of a stove for 110 square feet, so I don't have to use that much wood, and it's pretty easy to overheat the place even in the middle of winter when it's 5 degrees outside. So for me, living small was a necessity at first. I started construction really late August, early September, and here in the High Rockies, winter comes pretty early. So small was the only option. Now I've come to really enjoy a small house in numerous ways. One is it just asks me to be outside more often, which is what life is kind of about for me, is being outside, getting outside, doing everything from gardening to mountain biking to walking, hiking, and all that stuff. Living small asks us to reevaluate every piece of what makes a house work.
So Daniel's not actually in our film. We interviewed a lot of people all around the country, and I think one of the things that I loved meeting all these people, we met so many people who were really kind of viewing their lives as an experiment, and their houses really kind of reflected that. So I think that comes through in the way that Daniel was talking about his home. So tiny houses are obviously not a new idea. The most well-known kind of historical tiny house figure is probably Henry David Thoreau, who built his cabin on Walden Pond not only as a way to kind of simplify and find out what was most important to him, but also as kind of a political statement. During Thoreau's time, there were a lot of people like today who were building huge vacation homes in the woods and on lakes and things like that. And Henry David Thoreau built Walden as sort of a statement against those people who were kind of living in these large vacation homes.
So in more recent history, right after World War II, we saw this new phenomenon where the American dream really became defined as, everybody has their own house in suburbia with, their family and a car in the garage. And, so that same thing that Henry David Thoreau was, sort of reacting against is kind of come back around to some extent. And to illustrate that point, this is one of the characters in our film.
1950, the median square footage for a single-family home was just under 1,000 square feet. In 1970, it was about 1,400 square feet, and then take up to 2007, and it's 2,700 square feet. And then in 2010, which is the most recent numbers I have, it was back down to just under 2,400 square feet.
So that was Mimi Zeiger. She's an author who writes about tiny houses and an architect. So you can see in the numbers that she was quoting, house sizes have actually gone down a bit in the last few years since the housing crisis in 2008. In an even more dramatic response to the housing issues that came out at that time, we found out about this community of people who are dramatically downsizing around the country to live in tiny houses. And so after Christopher decided to build his own tiny house, we kind of started researching and planning more. And we found out that there was kind of this really vibrant online community of people who were, sharing how-tos, sharing building plans, sharing photos of their homes. And that's when we decided that we needed to make our documentary not just a film about the process of building a house from scratch, but also a film about this movement around the country. So, who are these people? They're mostly single people and couples. There are a few families that we found. They're in regions across the country, really popular in the Pacific Northwest and in California. Vermont and Texas have really lenient building codes, so they have a lot of tiny housers. The South as well. And self-proclaimed tiny housers are definitely people who are choosing to live small, people who have the option to live larger and have made the choice to downsize. So why do you guys think,
Sorry. So there's basically a really large online community of supporting the tiny house movement as well. As you can see, there's lots of blogs that write about tiny houses and have tons of different followers, and so basically it's a movement that's almost enabled by technology, which is interesting because it's also sort of a return to this this period that is sort of embodied by being close to the land and living simply, but it's really enabled by by this.
and what's been interesting to us is that even people who, it's not practical for them to downsize into these really small spaces, everyone seems to have a really soft space in their heart and be really fascinated by tiny houses. So I think, the ideas of living simply really appeal to everyone. So why do you guys think that people choose to live in tiny houses?
Anybody? This is a question. So.
They can afford it.
Mm-hmm, definitely. Any other ideas?
Could you say what the other?
He said because they can afford it.
Mm-hmm.
It has something to do with doll houses and feeling like you might be the doll in the dollhouse?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yep.
Exactly.
Brings you closer together. Say that again. Prioritize what's important. You can move more easily. Yeah.
Freedom from stuff.
Freedom from stuff.
Simplify.
Mm-hmm. Simplify.
Yeah, it's definitely most of the.
Ecological concerns.
Mm-hmm. Environmental.
Surprised it took that long to come up, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Less house cleaning.
That was less house cleaning for people.
Yeah, so sort of Christopher's main motivation and our main motivation going into this was environmental. Christopher was looking for a way to build a house that had minimal impact on the land and, minimal, resource usage and things like that. Another probably bigger motivation that we've seen in people that we've talked to is financial. The idea that you can own a home outright with no mortgage payment is really appealing to people. We met a lot of people who were doing this as a way to get out of debt, pay off student loans, save for retirement, things like that. And then also just quality of life. I think, the idea of quality over quantity and people wanting to focus their time and their money and their resources on relationships, spending time with friends and family, either, starting a small business or taking on a creative project, really prioritizing what was most important to them. And so here are two other characters from our film. Quick clip.
I think something in me decided I couldn't live in one more rental. So, and it's the kind of home, even if I had tons of money and was a decade or two younger, I'd still want this. This isn't my consolation prize. This is exactly what I want.
I wanted to do something unique. I wanted to design my own house, Being in architecture, it's something everybody wants to do in architecture. Buildings produce, when I took my LEED exam, it was something like 70% of all the pollution in the air are caused by buildings. If we can minimize some of that, we can make a huge impact.
So that was Kat and Pacifico. They're a couple that we met in Healdsburg, California. And then Macy Mueller, she's an architect in Boise, Idaho.
One last reason that we thought was really interesting in particular was a lot of the people we talked to really see living in tiny houses as being an act of civil disobedience. They think that the building codes are onerous or out of date. And so because it's sort of a quasi-legal status of living in these temporary structures, they think they're doing their part, to sort of protest these unjust laws. And I think that's interesting because it also sort of ties back in with Thoreau, who was a big proponent of civil disobedience. So we're going to take a break for a second, or maybe a tangent is a better word, and talk a little bit about the building process that I guess we went through. It started as me and ended up being we.
He needed help.
I was like 6 months in.
It was taking a really long time.
Yeah. So this is my house, believe it or not. Or more accurately, this is the foundation of the house. And this is how I got it brand new from the trailer source. And then they're built just like any other house where you start with, you frame it out. First we built a subfloor and then we put up the frames. And then you close it all in, you sheet it up, you cut out the windows, and pretty soon the house starts to take shape once you put the rafters on and the ridge beam. So they really are built, exactly like a house with the exception of there is wheels instead of cement. And so when the exterior was finished, then we still had to do everything on the inside. You think with building a house is like, well, once you see it, it looks like a house, it's done. But actually, this was probably in November, and it took a full year, starting in May and ending in May. So this is like not even halfway. So we used a lot of reclaimed materials. This is some reclaimed hardwood flooring from Resource, which is out on Arapahoe. It's an amazing resource for everybody who wants to do home projects. They also have a tool library, which is like pretty much one of the most brilliant things, where you can actually just rent tools for like $5 a day. But if you were going to do that at Home Depot, it cost $25. So just check them out. And this is Merete. After she started coming out every day and helping out, she got really into it, literally, as you can tell. Sorry, I kind of zoomed past that last one. Here we use this is barnwood, which was found up in Netherlands, and on the walls and on the trim, which I'm putting up, is beetle kill pine, which is a product, or a byproduct, if you will, of the mountain pine beetle infestation in the Rocky Mountains, which has killed millions of lodgepole pines. And now they kind of harvest that wood, which is a fire hazard, and they turn it into building products. So we use a lot of that in the house.
And I would say that the point that it took a year to build is kind of funny because we have all this early interview footage with Christopher when he first started, and I was like, how long do you think this is going to take? And he was like, 2.5, 3 months. And I was like, really? Are you sure? And so it ended up taking a full year. Christopher pretty much figured it out as he went along. We have great footage of him sort of like watching YouTube and wiring outlets at the same time, learning how to do it, so that always gets a laugh.
And we didn't die. It's great.
So this is sort of one of the more kind of triumphant moments midway through the film.
So we're going to start on one end, and I'm going to reach up and I'm going to hammer the bottom, and go down, and then we're going to fold it, or something.
should take a moment here too to credit some of the people that we worked with. Our composer who composed our original score, his name is Timothy Cleary. He's from Boulder, and that was some of his music. And then we also worked with a man named Kevin Hoth, who lives here in Boulder, who contributed some photography and cinematography.
Including the last shot there.
So obviously this kind of extreme living situation isn't realistic for everyone, but it's still, tiny houses still are really interesting for a lot of reasons. One particular question that we were really interested in was kind of exploring the idea of home and asking, what is this thing that we call home? And if it can fit in 125 square feet, what is that? Visiting so many tiny homes, that were condensed down to the essentials really kind of taught us what elements make us feel at home in a place. Things like relationships and people, a tie to community and a sense of place, and then also kind of those archetypal design elements like the pitched roof, porches, things like that kind of help us make a space into a home.
Okay, so one thing that we set out to explore in the film, but because of the way that the story came together, we didn't really delve that deep into this topic, but I think it's actually really fascinating and worth talking about here, and that's how tiny houses and what we learn from them can actually help us design more just communities and more sustainable communities.
So here's a quick clip from one of the expert voices that we interviewed, a woman named Karen Chappell. She's a professor at CU Berkeley.
So this is a 450 square foot cottage. A group of students proposed using my house as an example for their class on sustainability. Infill development is a form of development in older cities that fills in vacant or underutilized parcels that are typically between built-up parcels. Whether they're old industrial sites, whether they're dilapidated houses, or old garden sheds, etc. People argue that we can satisfy much of our development needs through doing urban infill development instead of building on the fringe of our metropolitan areas.
So Karen's research is really interesting. She and her students are actually looking at urban infill development and looking at backyard cottages as a solution for affordable housing in the Bay Area. So for example, instead of building a huge affordable housing development with everyone concentrated into one city block, she's looking at building these 300 to 400 square foot backyard cottages, which would then contribute to more diverse, more varied communities throughout the Bay Area, which is sort of one application of these ideas to a broader scale. There are obviously lots of people living small, not by choice, by necessity. And I think one of the interesting things about this movement is ways that we can apply the design aesthetic and principles of tiny houses to really make small spaces that are livable. So these examples are from the Rural Studio, which is a project at Auburn University in Alabama. And they have a $20,000 house project, which is a project to build these small houses for $20,000, which is the affordable housing stipend given to low-income people by the state of Alabama. And they produce really, really beautiful homes. And they're not necessarily, I don't think they would call themselves tiny housers, but it's similar.
One more thing that I really particularly like about the tiny house movement is that it's sort of a laboratory, as Daniel said in the video we did on him, and essentially it's a kind of a testing ground for all these new technologies that are going to have to become a little bit more commonplace in the future as the population grows and as resources sort of become a little more scarce. So this is an example of a composting toilet, for example, space-saving techniques, solar, and this is actually some technology taken from sailboats. That's an alcohol burning stove. and more solar. So tiny houses give us that opportunity to really start employing some of these new technologies and seeing what we can do with them and if we can really live off them.
And I think that a lot of those technologies and innovations can be applied to houses of any scale. The same thing with a lot of tiny house design. This is Jay Schaefer and his family. You saw his tiny house earlier. So Jay Schaefer is now living in a 500 square foot house it was an old house that he renovated with his wife and 2 sons. And he's sort of like the main figure of the tiny house movement, and he's the first one to say that, this is not realistic for people with families. But the point isn't like who can downsize their family into the smallest space. The point is to ask, how much space do I need, and what's livable for me and my family. I'm sure he would love to downsize his family into a tiny house, but his wife wasn't so into that. So these are just a few examples of, in Colorado you see a lot of sort of old historic mining cottages that are actually smaller than what would be legal to build today. So out in Longmont, you see a lot of houses that would be illegal to build today. So for people who are interested in living small but don't want to live in a tiny house, a great option is to find sort of an older historic home and renovating it.
So there are actually a few things that are kind of standing in the way of tiny houses becoming more widespread and more widely adopted. So the first thing is that codes are kind of out of date. Now, we're not advocates of getting rid of all the codes because they're there for a good reason. It has a lot to do with health and public safety. But they do sort of reflect a different mindset. And they're kind of a holdover from the 50s and the 60s and 70s. She wants to live in a tiny house. The other thing too is that because they're built on wheels, there's a lot of issues around insurance and financing. Banks won't give money to build tiny houses, so even though they're cheaper overall, they're actually pretty expensive up front because you have to put all of the money up front when you build them, unless you get private loans or credit cards. And insurance, companies, they don't really want to finance. They don't really want to insure tiny houses for the same reason. They're just, it's sort of outside of their understanding of what a house is.
And there was actually a woman who had a tiny house in the Northwest that burned down recently, and she didn't have insurance. Her house wasn't insurable, but the tiny house community actually came together and raised her money to build a new house. So there are a lot of people kind of looking at like a co-op model for insurance for tiny houses.
As Jay Schaefer said in our interview with him, tiny houses work great together. And so there's been some work around designing tiny house communities. And that might look like basically like a trailer park model or some sort of co-op model where the land is owned together and then people just park their tiny houses on it. And what's interesting about that is a lot of the building codes are around this idea of preserving home value in neighborhoods. And they want all the houses in a neighborhood to be of similar size and value so no one's perceived home value or whatever goes up or down or no home value for that matter. So putting them together is like making neighborhoods and communities built around tiny houses with like nodes of sort of externalized resources like laundry facilities or libraries or something like that.
And this photo is it's a project called the Boneyard Studios in Washington, D.C., and there's actually a group of people turning an urban vacant lot into sort of a tiny house model community. So they're going to see if it works out.
Sorry. And then the last thing, and this is something I care a lot about, is just sort of normalizing the values associated with tiny houses and living small and downsizing. And instead of, rooms full of people getting together and being like, yeah, look how weird these people are, it'll be like, oh, tiny house, yeah, everybody I know lives in a tiny house. So maybe not that extreme. But the idea that, I guess what I'm getting at is that, I think that it should be acceptable in our culture to live in a small space and people don't look at you or judge you and think that maybe that you're not successful or that you don't have a choice, but they can see it as a real viable choice that a normal person would want to make.
And one quote that I love, Karen, that we showed you the clip of, she's kind of a tiny house skeptic, and we were interviewing her, and she said to us, tiny is weird, small is really interesting. And I think it's important that, these tiny houses are kind of so crazy. It's also good to think about, small as an option. That's almost a little bit, even harder to wrap your brain around because everyone can live a little bit smaller, even if you couldn't live tiny.
So we wanted to take a second and show you how our house turned out. So this is from the kitchen looking towards the front door, and from the front door looking towards the kitchen. So you can get a sense for, and that's a wide angle lens. So, so you can get an idea for how small it is. And that's the kitchen. And the bathroom is sort of down the hall to the left there, and you sleep up top there, and there's a little closet that you can put coats and brooms and things in. And basically the dimensions are about 7 feet wide by 19 feet long, and then there's a 3 foot long porch on the end.
And one of my favorite things about it is kind of the high window to wall ratio. And because there are so many windows in such a small space, it really invites the landscape in, which was one of the reasons for building the house in the first place. So we each sort of, after working on this project, have our different takeaways. I think for me, what the most interesting thing that I've learned is kind of how our society is changing. And I think that after talking to all these people, we've seen how, there's an older generation that's sort of reevaluating the American dream, either for financial reasons or because they find themselves with an empty nest and want to downsize, things like that. And then we also see a younger generation of people who are kind of looking for more flexibility and freedom and less of the mortgage, the marriage, car in the driveway, that old model. And I think this is exciting because it is opening up more potential for a more diverse, more varied neighborhoods and communities.
One of my big takeaways from this project in general is that, we've been to a lot of film festivals now, and we've seen a lot of films that are issue-based, and they talk about, especially environmental films that, it's like doom and gloom. It's like, look at all these, the world's ending, and, they don't all sometimes they have solutions, but a lot of times people aren't, the environmental movement doesn't always provide solutions, and I think tiny houses are a really tangible solution. They're an example of the kinds of solutions that we need to look for, because not that I'm suggesting everyone live in tiny houses, but, they're basically people who are doing it are still happy. They're doing it out of choice. They enjoy it. Yet they're treading lighter on the planet. They're consuming less resources. And I think in the future we're not going to really have a choice about somebody, I think it was Mimi who said that.
Mimi, one of our characters, we were asking her about the quote about how houses are getting smaller after the downturn in the economy. And we said, do you think that trend is going to continue, or are they going to keep getting smaller? And she said, no, eventually the economy will probably recover and they'll start getting bigger again. But she said, but because of environmental reasons, we're all going to have to start asking these questions. We don't have the resources. Gas prices are going to keep going up. These are questions that we're all going to have to ask, whether or not we want to.
So I guess in the future, I just hope that we can come up with more solutions that, that we're not doing because we have to, but we're doing because it actually improves our life and we're happier from doing it.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to leave you with one final clip from the film, which shows us bringing the tiny house to its final resting place in the mountains.
About ready to move the tiny house for its inaugural voyage, which means we're gonna see if it falls off.
Home is really a self-portrait.
We try and fill our lives with people, and I think people is what makes a home.
Think about living as an experiment instead of living as like you're making these choices that are dead-end choices.
I think for me, a sense of home is a sense of belonging.
I think that tiny houses really pose a question that everyone can relate to and that everyone is always asking, which is, what's important to me? And what do I want to surround myself with? Where do I want to wake up?
Like, you only got 10 minutes. really, when you look at it, your life is gonna go like that. You know, it's like, what do you want to do?
So those were all characters from the film. Tammy and Logan, who live in Portland, Oregon, and Ann and Darren, who live out in Longmont, and then this is Dee Williams, who lives in Olympia, Washington.
And you might remember her from the cover of the magazine at the beginning of the slideshow.
So that's the end. Thank you guys so much for coming.
So I think we have some time for some questions.
Yeah.
Oh man, there's so many.
Let's do down here in the front.
So what do you do when there's like, there's a tornado or a giant blizzard?
Well, if yeah, so the question is, what do you do if there's a tornado, a giant blizzard, or some other natural disaster, biblical flood, something like that? Well, if you have enough warning, you can actually just drive the house away. So that's handy. Yeah, and that's a great question. I mean, there's potentially some safety issues with tiny houses. If there's an earthquake, I actually had a class in this room with a famous, what do we call them, earthquakeologist, and yeah, seismologist. There you go. And he always said, you know, earthquakes don't kill people, buildings kill people. And so I guess, you know, if you're confined in a small space when there's an earthquake or a fire, yeah, I mean, that could be dangerous. And I think that's part of the building codes is, rather than forcing people around, working around the building codes, we should work within the building codes to make sure everybody lives in a safe place. But also that can enable people to live in the way they live.
Yeah, and I think also while we were building last spring, there was one day where I think there were like 90-mile-an-hour winds that were clocked coming down the canyon. And we got to the building site the next day, and like our table saw was like across the field and things like that. And the house was totally fine. So it's been fine so far.
Yeah, actually, because they're smaller, they actually have a lot of rigidity. And you know, so there's not a big span. Like, I mean, everything's really solid, and it feels really solid when you're in it.
In the middle here.
So you've lived in it for a while. Do you like it? Have you noticed that you like about it, or maybe you don't like about it? Or?
Sure. And this is something I meant to say at the beginning. We don't live in it full time. It was intentionally meant in the beginning, like I said, as a cabin, like in a place we can go back to. But we have been there a lot, and we like it quite a bit. And I think I forgot the second half of your question.
Well, sorry. Just the pluses and minuses.
Oh yeah. Do you want to jump in here? You're good at this.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm thinking, I mean, I think pluses and minuses, I mean, definitely being outside more. I mean, I think, we don't, because our house wasn't built to live in full time, we don't have that much storage space built in. People who build their houses meaning to live in them full time do have storage solutions to have their things. But, you know, there is a lack of, I mean, you can't have that much stuff.
Well, now that I have some time to think about it,
Yeah.
I really think the thing about tiny houses, they're not for the faint of heart, as it were. They're not like it's something that you move into thinking that everything's going to work all the time and that you don't have to think about where you live. You actually, it's sort of more of like a partnership between you and the house. You gotta, you know, you kind of like, for instance, we use the alcohol burning stove, which is, you know, you don't just simply turn it on. You got to fill the canisters and you light it. You don't have to do that. A lot of people have normal appliances, but in my case, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to have to think about those things. But yeah, I mean, they're definitely take a little bit more operation. But because people typically build them, they also already enjoy that kind of, and I think it attracts those kind of people.
Yeah.
How much does it weigh, like compared to a small Airstream trailer?
They're heavier than an Airstream for sure. I think I haven't weighed my house, but it's between 8,000 and 10,000 pounds, I would guess. Probably closer to 10, which takes a very large truck to pull it. We had to rent one. It was expensive.
And I would say most people who live in tiny houses aren't doing it to sort of travel in their house. I mean, they are able to move around, but most people build them on wheels as a way to get around building codes, not so much to travel.
Let's do this one in the back. Oh, y'all look so
Yeah,
tall.
you back there, in the way back.
I'm actually building one of these up near Estes Park.
Oh, cool.
I wondered if you guys could go in and move it to the utilities you did. Like, did you use the Harbor Freight solar cells, or did you do something else? So, is the composting
Cool. Great, so did everybody hear that?
He was asking about utilities, toilet, solar situation, water, things like that.
And you can talk to us afterwards, we can get even more specific, but I'll briefly talk about it real quick. We touch on it at the end of the film in the credits, but basically we have a composting toilet, and it's just a bucket with peat moss and sawdust that we built a toilet thing around. And that's the one thing that you can't actually do like a real house, because there's no real way to connect it to the sewer system. So you either have to do a composting toilet, or you have to do, there's sailboats have these like burning toilet things. Incinerating toilets. See, look at this is why the writer. Yeah, so that's what we do for that, and we built it ourselves. You can get kits, but honestly, just if you're building a house, you can build a toilet. And
whoa, that's a night.
And then we use a Dickinson propane stove, which is a sailboat fireplace basically to heat it, and it actually does a really good job of heating the whole entire building. And then for solar, we have it's Solman. It's made by this company called Sol Solutions, and it's actually a self-contained cart that the solar panel's attached to, and all the batteries and stuff are in it. And the reason we did that is because then everything's kept on the outside of the house, and actually I can either plug the house directly into the grid if it's near the grid, or we can just plug it into this cart, basically. And it actually puts out way more than the Harbor Freight panels that you're talking about. It's like 320 amp hours or something like that. Yeah. So.
And water, we haul water up because there's no well on the property.
That's no. We want to do that. All right, I'd like to see that sort of phase 2. We actually just finished the house in May, and right now we've just been bringing it up in big, like 5-gallon, like Eldora Springs kind of jugs.
Yeah. Okay, how about you back here?
I didn't see any ground preparation to parking. Can you take the tires off when you get there? Can you have a kind of a foundation that it sits on?
So the question is, what kind of preparation for the land and to put the house on it? And yeah, you can do it. You can put down a slab and you can park it on the slab. Well, I don't think we did anything. The lot is actually pretty flat, and so we had to maybe dig out for holes and like level it. I had the trailer custom built with these levels on the corners, or jacks, so then you can kind of level it really easily. And some people do platforms, but I think once you start getting into that, then you might have to actually go to the county and then get permits to do excavation and whatnot. I actually had a problem once we parked it. There was like a news piece about us moving the house up to the land, and within a week my county sent a letter and was like, do you have a driveway? Well, what are you doing for a toilet? And all these things. So we actually had to put in a driveway the following week. Okay.
How about you pick?
All right, I'm gonna pick. Sorry, I gotta go with Ryan.
What's the biggest slumber party you've had in there? How many have you fit in there?
That is a great question.
A few people who fit in there in this room right now, but I think we had 8 people. No, not everyone slept in the house. Most people camped on the land outside of the house.
But when we did a rough cut of our film, the very second people we showed it to was, we had everybody in the tiny house up on the land, and we showed it to them to get their feedback, and it was pretty fun. And actually, it worked well, wouldn't you say, Steve?
Yeah. Back.
How were you received at South by Southwest?
Really well, yeah. We had 3 screenings. All 3 screenings were sold out, which was great, which I think is kind of a testament to kind of the appeal of tiny houses and of these ideas and things like that. Yeah, and we're currently kind of figuring out wider distribution to have the film publicly distributed and screenings and things like that.
Yeah. I'll go with the guy in the white.
Do you guys do private consulting? My best friend Justin has a tiny house, and he needs all the help he can get. He's going to need some advice, I think. I've seen that thing.
We'll put you in touch with our agent.
Oh, okay.
I have a question about the environment. I built a house 35 years ago in the woods, and I had a well 550 feet deep, and was contaminated, high rated. And so I years later today, do you think, what's your idea about living solo out in space versus in a community so that at least you can monitor the water?
That's actually a really great question. And one that we haven't gotten before, so that's cool. So the question was, do we have concerns about living so far in the middle of nowhere? Because in this gentleman's case, there was some radium poisoning in his well, and so he had to join the city. And I'm presuming for water or whatever. And yeah, actually that is a concern because so the piece of land I bought is on a giant subdivision that used to have an HOA, which they disbanded back in the 70s, but all the mineral rights were kept and then sold to somebody else. So actually they're starting to do some exploratory wells for natural gas in the area, maybe 20 miles away. So yeah, I mean, I guess they could, in theory, move closer to where I am, and potentially there's been some, maybe gas could leak in the aquifer. I don't know, and yeah, that would be a problem. I mean, I don't have a well yet. I could drill a well, so that might be a problem down the road. But honestly, I guess if that ever were to happen, that would be unfortunate. But luckily, the house is on wheels, so that's a good idea. Do you want to pick someone?
To you way back in the back corner.
I have a question. Moving about in the tiny house, does it feel like you're in a suspended building, or does it feel like you're on solid ground?
Mm-hmm. We've only moved the house that one time that we filmed from the building location in Boulder up to the resting place in the mountains, and we weren't actually inside of the house when we drove it. We were in the truck pulling it. When it's parked, it definitely, I mean, when there's really strong winds, you feel like a little bit, of shake and things like that, but nothing concerning. I mean, it definitely feels like a building on a foundation when it's parked, to me.
Yeah, I agree. It's really well insulated too. That was a big concern for me in particular because the house sits at 9,500 feet, which is really high up and it gets really cold. So we had spray foam insulation, soy-based. And the floor is really well insulated. So when you step on it, I mean, it feels, and when you walk in, you just kind of feel that insulation, and it feels solid. Back there. Yeah.
You might have covered this, and I may have missed it. What was your total cost?
Yeah, actually, we didn't. Yeah, so it's a great question. It was $26,000 total, and not everybody spends that much on theirs. I think I've heard of people doing it for those, 4,000?
Yeah, no, I think maybe like 10 to 12 is probably.
I mean, 10 to 12 is more common. There was that one girl who did it for like $4,000. Anyways, it's I think you're going to spend it on the low side $10,000, and on the high side, some people spend $30,000. And it really depends. And this is one thing that's really great about tiny houses is they're really customizable. So if you like granite countertops, you could put granite countertops in. If you like, I don't know, shag rugs, you can do that. But the reason mine would cost as much as it did is I bought a new trailer. You can spend some time and wait for a good used trailer to come out. We didn't really have the time because we were making this film. And you can also use more reclaimed materials, but then the more reclaimed materials you use, you make a trade-off in time. Either removing the nails or whatever, or waiting for them to come available on Craigslist. So just because of the time we ended up spending, $26,000, we probably could have done it for like 18.
Yeah, and tiny houses are actually more expensive per square foot, because there's not so much filler space of just drywall or just wood and things like that. But again, it's kind of the quality versus quantity trade-off. How about, you've had your hand up for a while.
I've got a question about the Park County assessor. Does he view your property as improved land or as unimproved land? Is it residential or is it raw?
That's actually a really good question. And so the question was, does the Park County assessor view the house as approved land or raw land? And actually, I was wondering what was going to happen because I had my property taxes from the first year when there wasn't a house on it. And then I just got it this week for this year, and actually they're the same. So I guess in their mind, it isn't an improvement.
They might be on a 2-year cycle.
So they might be on a 2-year cycle.
That's what Boulder is.
Yeah. Well, and actually, that's a great question. That if it did change, I would probably go take it up with them only because it's in a temporary structure, and if once I move it away, the value of the land is going to be what it was, essentially what it would be normally.
But your assessment rate also changes on residential property. It's 9%, on vacant land it's 29% assessment rate, so it might go down by virtue of it being residential.
That would be amazing.
How about David in the back?
So a question about the cultural acceptability issue. I'm curious, do you have any good examples of less than positive responses, or even negative ones, to the film and maybe the house itself from family or people screenings or whatever it is, and what you make of that, what you make of those kinds of reactions?
I think we haven't really had negative reactions to our faces, and I think, but we definitely, so the Huffington Post, we had some coverage on the Huffington Post and a lot of online news when we first finished building the house last spring. And so, I mean, people who wouldn't say things to our faces will say it in online comments. And I think, there is, when you're dealing with kind of like home and ideas around home, it's so close to our identities, of who we are and what we believe in, that I think, I think in some ways it could potentially feel threatening to people. And I think sometimes, people responded as if we were directly criticizing them for their lifestyle. But I think, what's great about the tiny house movement is that it doesn't really take itself seriously. It's so kind of like silly and experimental that, I don't think anyone is really being that harsh, so.
Yeah, and we actually got this question earlier in Patty's class, and I'm going to say the same thing, which is essentially that we've met people from all over the political spectrum that live in tiny houses, and so it's not really, I guess in my mind, I was coming at it, I was like, from my lens, which is like a liberal from Boulder, thinking like, oh, all these environmentalists are going to be out living in a tiny houses because they want to save the environment. But then you also get a lot of conservatives who are, they don't want the government to be involved in their lives, and they really like that simplicity and the sort of urban or the rural homesteading aspect of it, and so you get just all sorts of people, and they all kind of come around and are part of the same community, all because of tiny houses. It's pretty cool.
I'm wondering if your tiny house fulfilled your dream cabin in the woods?
So the question is, did the tiny house fulfill my dream of living in a cabin or having a cabin in the woods? And yes, it very much did. It was pretty much not too far from what I envisioned. I probably would have made it a little wider, because right now I can do this and touch the walls. And so I think my dream was probably more like 300 square feet, but I'll take 124.
Yeah.
Sure. One of the biggest impediments to the tiny house activities are building codes, like you said, which are really relic from, it's not the bad, but they never was considering them. So I wondered, within the movement, especially with tumbleweed, is there any attempt to try to convince the code makers that there's a way to adapt to allow this kind of construction without it actually endangering public health?
Yeah, we actually, in the fall, we had the opportunity to speak at a conference of urban planners in Boise, Idaho, and we showed some clips from the film to a room full of building code people and urban planners and people who are responsible for enforcing those codes, and everyone was actually very receptive to it. And I think that, even people like Karen, who you saw, who definitely believes that codes are necessary to preserve safety and, especially for people who are renting and who don't have the power to advocate for themselves and things like that. But I think everyone, including Karen, would say that our building codes need to be updated. And there is quite a bit of activism. The people behind Boneyard Studios, who are doing that community in Washington, D.C., they recently submitted a petition, and I'm not sure what the status of that is, but
I'm not sure either.
Yeah.
So I think one thing that I think most people in communities that are interested in smart growth and smart development are looking at smaller structures and making that more accessible. Part of the issue is that all the codes are drafted by one body, and they're based in, I forget where they're based, but it's called the International Residential Building Codes, and it's pretty much only used by the US. And counties kind of, from what I understand, kind of just adopt them without, amending them too much, because it takes a lot of effort, and they can just sort of take these recommendations. It becomes easier. So really, it's a question about engaging with them. And so Jay Schaefer, who's a little bit of a firebrand, talked to them, or he sent many emails to them, and he never got responses, but I think he might have come at it a little more confrontational than other people might. But yeah, I think there's some movement towards trying to make that happen. So.
I just offer one little thing about acceptability. I built a small house behind my home on an alley in Old Town, Arvada, and so 364 square feet. And it's been embraced. I've rented it 3 times in 2 years, and each time I put it on Craigslist, I get 100 people who respond. They really are diverse, all kinds of people. And the 3 tenants have been wonderful and have loved the place. So I think it's the kind of thing that actually can be accepted in a broad number of places.
Yeah, I think the people are kind of ahead of the game from the regulations and stuff now, because I think the popularity is far outpaced the sort of the structures, like we were mentioning with the financing and the insurance and stuff. The institutions haven't caught up to what people want. Really.
And I mean, you're seeing like companies, I think IKEA is starting to they're doing like a prefab tiny house thing, and
actually they just announced they're building a town.
Oh, that's weird.
Maybe a tiny house town.
But I mean, I think even commercially, as you see it gaining more mainstream acceptability, maybe then the governments and the code people will pay a bit more attention. So.
Either one of you. You choose a critic.
I'll go first.
Okay.
Does Boulder have a minimum limit?
It does, and actually, I'm not familiar with this. I think it's something like 1,200. But does Jules? Did you find out in your research?
I think it's
600? Okay, I was totally misinformed.
Boulder does have some pretty strict regulations against having temporary structures like RVs and tiny houses parked within the Boulder city limits. So it's quite hard to have a tiny house in Boulder.
Like in your backyard and stuff. Yeah, I actually had that trailer parked on the street in the photo, and I got a notice that I had to move it, even though it was attached to a truck and was obviously going to move soon. And the more.
Can I just ask, in all of your tour, did you find any particularly unique or innovative tiny bathroom designs?
That's a great question.
Other than composting toilet, showers, anything that stood out?
Sure, and there's a shower in my place too, although it requires a solar shower. It's like a bag, so it's not. But people have running water and things like that.
Yeah, I would look at, if you're interested, Tiny Tack House. You can Google them. They have a ton of photos, and I don't know that it's necessarily that different, but they sort of have a full, water heater hookup setup.
And their shower is it's cool. It's an old wine barrel.
Yeah.
That they stand in, and it's pretty cool.
Showerhead,
yeah. And then Jay's tiny house, he actually has been experimenting with these Japanese tubs they're bathtubs, but you sit in them, kind of like. And then you shut the door, and it looked pretty cool.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. How about here?
Part of the project you said was to ask, what is a home? As we're talking about this, what's the difference between a tiny house and like living in an Airstream trailer? Is an Airstream be considered a tiny home?
I mean, I think, like Christopher said, the lines are really blurred and the definitions are really varied. I think it definitely could be. I think that for the purposes of the film, we decided to strictly define a tiny house as sort of less than 200 square feet on a flatbed trailer, that sort of traditional wood post and beam construction.
Yeah, I think there's actually been some work around that. There's a friend of ours made a film called 23 Feet, which kind of talks about that a little bit. And I know there's been some books and stuff. And I think that it could. I mean, a home is such a personal thing that you define it however it is that you define it. And that's what we thought was fascinating with the tiny houses is the sort of reductionist approach to looking at it. It's like the more you take away and it's still home, then really home could be anywhere, kind of like that Edward Sharpe song. Yeah. If you guys are familiar.
2 or 3 years from now, will you still be doing tiny houses and be even more expert, or are you gonna pick a new area, new thing to go after? And if you are, have you already picked it? In other words, what's next?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because we sort of stumbled into this. You know, Christopher was going to build a cabin, and then we decided to make a film. So I think that personally, I'm still really interested in ideas of home, and I think that's not going to go away. And I think we're still interested in talking about tiny houses for a while yet, but I don't think, maybe not forever. But yeah, but I think some of the same themes, definitely. I mean, I'm still going to be exploring, but you can answer that for yourself.
Yeah. Basically, I think that we're drawn to tiny houses naturally for just the different issues that we're already interested in, but we don't really see ourselves as tiny house people. And I don't mean that in any sort of disparaging way, because obviously I built one, and therefore by definition I am. But there are people who are really committed to, you know, making this a sustainable movement of people and actually making all those changes. And of course we want to contribute to that. But I first identify as a filmmaker, and I want to do more films on different subjects. And so, so yeah, I mean, I'll probably always be interested, but I'm open to move on to other things as well.
Seeing as how the film is about living small, I was wondering if you guys interviewed anyone like living in New York City who live in small apartments, people like Graham Hill, or anyone living in like shipping containers, just other things besides houses on trailers.
Yeah, we didn't, just because for kind of trying to make a streamlined narrative, we kind of had to just define tiny houses as being kind of a limited thing. So we didn't kind of go into apartments and things like that. We recently talked to someone who's living in a dumpster, who refitted a dumpster to be a house. So that's interesting. We didn't meet him in person, but.
And well, we went and interviewed this guy out in the middle of Texas who lived in more like a tiny house on a foundation, but he was building this giant greenhouse out of shipping containers, and that's the thing is like it's kind of weird. The green building world and the tiny house world, although they're very similar and they're parallel, you meet a lot of tiny people who aren't necessarily, you know, they don't mix as much with the cob house people, you know, or the like straw bale people. Although they're all straw bale tiny houses. No, I mean it's. I'm generalizing, of course.
We're so humorous. This is great. Yeah. 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 So we are in the process of submitting to a bunch of film festivals in Colorado and things like that. So we don't know exactly when our Colorado premiere is going to be. The reason we couldn't show it publicly here tonight is because a lot of film festivals won't accept us if we've had a previous public screening in Colorado. So we have a website, which is tiny-themovie.com. We also have a Facebook page. So those are the two best ways to be updated as soon as those screenings are announced. We're hoping within the next few months, but we're kind of waiting to hear back.
Yeah, and just if you guys have relatives or friends or family, we know for sure that it will be showing in Toronto, Minneapolis, Boston, and San Francisco, and the Berkshires. So, you know, anybody in those places. Yeah.
Yeah.
One last one.
So how did you fund the making of the film?
That's a good question too.
Yeah, we ran a Kickstarter campaign about a year and a half ago, and that's how we made most of the post-production funds for the film. And then beyond that, sort of a bit of self-funded and private donations and things like that. But Kickstarter was a great resource.
Yeah, a lot of it was, and that's part of the challenge of building the house, is that when we were making the film and building the house, you know, we'd get some money and we're like, okay, does this go to the house or does it go to the film? And we had to make those choices often, and yeah, the film didn't cost as much to make as a lot of people spend on films, and we didn't know we were making a feature film. We thought we were making a short, so we didn't ask for a lot of money in Kickstarter, and we didn't, set out with those ambitions, and it kind of grew, and we had a lot of help from a lot of people who gave their time and stuff. So it was really nice.
Yeah, thank you.